October 1918. The Argonne Forest, France. A place where sunlight barely broke through the canopy and where every shadow could hide a rifle, a trap, or a whisper of death. The final Allied offensive of World War I had begun, and among the thousands of men pushing through the mud, roots, and choking smoke was a group of roughly 700 Americans from the 77th Division. They were a mix of factory workers, miners, immigrants, farmhands, and clerks, many from New York City. Ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary hell. History would soon call them one thing: the Lost Battalion. Their commander, Major Charles Whittlesey, had been ordered to advance deep into a ravine and hold it against the Germans. What he didn't know was that the French units on his left and the American units on his right had been forced back. His orders had been issued based on outdated reports. When Whittlesey's men pushed forward, they were walking into a pocket, an unintentional spearhead with no support on either side. By the time they realized what had happened, German forces had closed behind them like a tightening noose. Within hours, Whittlesey and roughly 550 men who made it into the ravine were surrounded. Cut off, no food, little water, no way out. German forces above them on the slopes turned the ravine into a shooting gallery. Snipers watched every movement. Machine guns swept across any exposed ground. Artillery fire echoed from all directions, trapping the men in a bowl of earth and smoke. And the worst part, the American supply and communication lines had been severed. The only way headquarters knew anything was through runners, young men who had to climb out of the ravine, sprint across open ground, and dodge German fire for a chance of reaching friendly lines. Every runner sent from the Lost Battalion was cut down. One by one, shot, captured, or vanished into the forest. By the second day, Whittlesey knew they were alone. The Germans, realizing that this isolated battalion posed a threat to their defensive lines, issued demands for surrender, sending messengers under white flags. Whittlesey famously refused to respond, even when threatened with annihilation. But bravery doesn't stop bullets. His men were being killed by the hour. Ammunition was dwindling. Medical supplies were gone. The wounded cried for water, but anyone who tried to reach the nearby stream was gunned down instantly. Headquarters, unaware of the battalion's exact location, attempted to send help. But with no communication, the rescue attempts were blind, disorganized, and deadly. The lines of the Argonne were a labyrinth of ravines and ridges. If the Lost Battalion couldn't tell headquarters where they were, no one could help them. So Whittlesey turned to the last communication tools he had left: carrier pigeons. Each had a tiny aluminum cylinder strapped to its leg, ready to deliver a message back to command post. But sending a pigeon meant revealing the battalion's position, because German marksmen were trained to kill them on sight. If the bird flew, the Germans would see, and the Germans would shoot. Still, Whittlesey had no choice. The first pigeon was released. It flapped above the trees, then a rifle crack. Feathers drifted toward the forest floor. The second pigeon didn't make it 50 yards. Hours passed. The circle tightened. The men were exhausted, starving, dying. Then came the worst moment of the entire siege. American artillery, trying desperately to support the missing battalion, began bombarding the very ravine Whittlesey's men were trapped in. Allied shells rained down on Allied soldiers. Trees shattered. Dirt erupted. Body after body was thrown into the air. It was friendly fire, but it wasn't stopping. The Lost Battalion was being killed by its own side. Whittlesey ran from crater to crater, screaming for someone to find a way to signal headquarters. But they had no flares left, no working radios, no runners, no visibility to send semaphore, and 2 pigeons already lay dead. Only one remained. A small, gray-feathered bird with a streak of white down its wing. Pigeon number 436, known to the Signal Corps as Cher Ami, dear friend. The men looked at the bird as if looking at a miracle they were afraid to touch. If she died, they died. It was that simple. Whittlesey scribbled a message on a scrap of paper. His handwriting shook not from fear, but from exhaustion. It read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He rolled the message, slipped it into the metal tube, and latched it to Cher Ami's leg. Soldiers gathered around the small wicker pigeon basket. Some crossed themselves. Some whispered good luck. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, as if watching their last hope flutter inside a cage. At 2 p.m., they opened it. Cher Ami burst into the sky, and all hell awakened around her. German snipers immediately fired. Rifles cracked, machine guns rattled. A storm of bullets ripped through the branches as the tiny bird fought upward with frantic wing beats. A shot struck her. Her body jolted midair. But she didn't fall. She spiraled, losing altitude, fluttering hard, rising again on sheer instinct. Another bullet tore through her chest. Another shattered one of her legs. But somehow, impossibly, she kept flying. Men in the ravine watched with open mouths as she drifted beyond the tree line, wobbling, dipping, nearly crashing, yet always pushing forward. The Germans kept firing, but Cher Ami kept climbing. Minutes later, at headquarters nearly 25 miles away, pigeon keepers saw a limp gray form drop from the sky and hit the ground with a thud. One of her legs was gone. Her chest was torn open. She was blind in one eye. But strapped to her remaining leg was the message. The artillery stopped. Within hours, relief units began redirecting their movements. Communications corrected, coordinates updated, reinforcement waves shifted toward the ravine. And because the friendly fire had ceased, dozens more men survived the night. Cher Ami, bleeding, crippled, barely alive, had delivered the message that saved 194 soldiers from death, annihilation, or capture. That's where most stories end. But ours is only beginning. As night fell over the Argonne, the men of the lost battalion huddled in silence, the forest echoing with distant artillery and the moans of the wounded. They didn't yet know if Cher Ami had made it. They only knew that their own artillery had stopped hammering them. Whether it was a coincidence or a sign of hope, no one could say. But every man clung to the possibility that the pigeon had reached friendly lines. Major Whittlesey walked through the mud-soaked ravine like a ghost, checking positions, whispering encouragement, doing what little he could to keep morale from collapsing. He passed men whose uniforms were shredded by shrapnel, men with bandaged limbs, men too weak to stand. He passed the small pile of empty ration tins, days old now, and the shallow puddles where soldiers had been scooping muddy water despite the risk of infection. He listened to the wounded calling softly for medics who no longer had supplies to give. Still, they held. Whittlesey had ordered that no man present a white flag, no matter how dire things became. The Germans, frustrated by the Americans' stubborn refusal to surrender, tried psychological warfare. They shouted into the ravine, promising safety if the battalion gave up. They fired volleys at random intervals to keep the men on edge. And at night, they launched sudden bursts of machine gun fire, trying to break the Americans' will through exhaustion and terror. But the lost battalion stayed in place, clutching their rifles, waiting for a rescue they couldn't see or hear. By the morning of October 5th, their numbers had dwindled further. Bodies covered in ponchos lay along the ravine walls. Medics whispered final prayers over dying men. The forest reeked of smoke, sweat, blood, and decay. Yet in the midst of all this, the battalion's resolve hardened. If headquarters got the message, help was coming. If not, they would fight until the last cartridge, the last breath, the last heartbeat. Around midday, faint gunfire echoed from the north, different from what they'd been hearing. More organized, more sustained. It was unclear who was firing or why, but any noise from outside the encirclement sparked a flicker of hope. Soldiers leaned forward, straining to hear whether the battle lines were shifting. At that same moment, miles away, in a makeshift medical station near the division command post, stretcher-bearers carried in a small wooden box. Inside it lay Cher Ami, unconscious, soaked in blood, one leg dangling by a tendon. Pigeon handlers rushed to her side, astonished at the bird's injuries. They saw the message tube still attached, miraculously intact. The handwritten note inside was immediately delivered to the artillery command, confirming the lost battalion's exact location and the catastrophic friendly fire situation. Officers gasped when they read the words. Orders flew across the room like lightning. Guns were redirected, runners dispatched, maps corrected. The entire division shifted its operational picture based on a few inches of rolled paper delivered by a broken pigeon. By early afternoon, a coordinated rescue plan was underway, but reaching the ravine would not be simple. German machine gun nests, dug-in riflemen, and thick forests made approaching the lost battalion a deadly challenge. Units attempting to reach Whittlesey's men had already been repulsed multiple times. Now, though, at least they knew where to push and where not to fire. Inside the ravine, as afternoon light filtered dimly through the trees, the Germans renewed their assault, perhaps sensing that the Americans were nearing their breaking point. Mortar rounds fell closer. Snipers picked off men who tried to shift positions. A German assault group attempted to probe the southern ridge, but a handful of exhausted American riflemen fought them off. Every inch of ground was contested, every second a battle for survival. Then, as daylight faded, something changed. The rifle fire from the north grew louder, sharper, closer. American forces were fighting their way toward the ravine. Still, the Germans weren't about to let their encirclement collapse easily. They poured reinforcements into the surrounding woods and increased their fire on the trapped battalion, trying to finish them before help arrived. The lost battalion had to endure another night, their fourth, of constant pressure and dwindling strength. Men collapsed where they sat. Some drifted into brief sleep, only to jolt awake at the crack of rifle fire overhead. Whittlesey barely rested, pacing through the darkness, keeping watch on both his men and the faint firefights beyond the tree line. On the morning of October 6th, a thick mist rolled through the ravine. The damp air muffled sound, but not enough to hide the growing presence of American troops moving in the distance. At times, the men heard shouted commands, the thump of grenades, the bark of rifles drawing closer. But every time hope swelled, machine gun bursts would roll through the trees, reminding everyone that the Germans still held the high ground. Meanwhile, Cher Ami, astonishingly, still clung to life. Medics stitched her chest wound, attempted to save her severed leg, and did what little they could to stabilize the heroic bird. She was barely breathing, but she was breathing. No one knew how long she had struggled through the sky, bleeding and blind, but everyone now knew what her final mission had meant. Without her, the lost battalion would have been obliterated by their own artillery. Back in the ravine, one soldier, Private Elmer Holm, noticed something unusual. The rifle fire on one side of the valley had shifted direction. It wasn't aimed at them anymore. It was aimed past them. Holm whispered to his squad mates, "They're pushing the line. They're coming." Minutes later, for the first time in days, an American signal flare arced into the sky from beyond the ridge. A green streak, faint but unmistakable. The lost battalion erupted in weak cheers, some men crying openly despite the danger of attracting sniper fire. They knew rescue was near. But the Germans reacted instantly, launching a violent barrage toward the rescuers and toward Whittlesey's men. Shells exploded at the rim of the ravine, trees splintered, mud rained down, and once again, the lost battalion was caught in the crossfire. Still, the sound of American machine guns grew louder, closer, more determined. For the first time since entering the ravine, Whittlesey allowed himself to believe they might actually make it out alive. And yet, even with the rescue so near, the forest had one more trial to throw at them. Just as hope crept into the ravine, a sudden crushing silence fell across the northern slope. The gunfire stopped, the shouting faded, even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Men who had been clutching rifles with trembling hands looked at one another, unsure whether the quiet meant salvation or another trick. Major Whittlesey scanned the misty tree line, listening intently. Silence in the Argonne was rarely a good sign. When the Germans grew quiet, it meant they were preparing something. A flanking move, a charge, a new layer of deception. Many of the men feared it meant the final crushing assault. Then, without warning, a German voice echoed from somewhere above them. It shouted commands, rapid, clipped, urgent-sounding. The tone was unmistakable, not confidence but alarm. Something had shifted in the enemy's lines. Something had gone wrong for them. Rifle shots rang out again, but not in the direction of the lost battalion. They were aimed outward, toward advancing American forces now pressing hard into the German perimeter. For the first time since entering the ravine, Whittlesey and his men heard the enemy's fear instead of their own. Still, the Germans weren't ready to give up the kill. They unleashed a barrage of machine gun fire downhill, forcing the lost battalion to hug the dirt, pressing their faces into the mud as bullets ripped overhead. Men covered the wounded with their own bodies. Medics shouted for help that couldn't come. The smell of gunpowder and churned earth filled every breath. As the firefight intensified beyond the ridge, something unexpected happened. A single German mortar round arced high into the sky and detonated on the northern lip of the ravine, far short of the lost battalion's position. It was aimed at the advancing Americans, not at Whittlesey's men. And it told the trapped soldiers something critical. The enemy was now fighting on two fronts. Whittlesey turned to his officers. "They're stretched thin," he whispered. "They know we're not their only problem anymore." Hours passed in brutal, grinding combat. The day warmed, the mist thinned, and the battlefield sounds sharpened. Every now and then, a wounded American from outside the ravine crawled into sight, trying to reach the lost battalion's shelter. Some made it, some didn't. The men inside watched helplessly, powerless to leave their pits. In one moment that stuck with many survivors for the rest of their lives, a young soldier named Private Thomas Bragg tried to crawl toward a wounded comrade lying exposed on a slope. But the instant Bragg lifted from cover, a German sniper fired, hitting him in the shoulder. Bragg fell, rolled, and slid into the ravine, his face pale with shock. Two men dragged him back as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Even acts of mercy carried mortal danger. By mid-afternoon, rifle fire from the north had grown so intense that it sounded like an unbroken roar. The Germans were being driven back yard by yard. Whittlesey stood behind a tree trunk, peering upward whenever he dared, watching for the first glimpse of friendly uniforms. But instead, what he saw next was something else. A German officer, flanked by two riflemen, gesturing urgently and shouting orders as they attempted to reposition a machine gun nest. Their movements were hurried and panicked. They clearly didn't expect the Americans to break through this fast. The machine gun crew didn't get far. A hail of American rifle fire swept across the ridge, dropping two of them instantly. The German officer dove behind a rock and crawled out of view. Shouts in German followed, fearful, chaotic. The enemy line was cracking. In the ravine below, men whispered to one another, "They're pulling back. Look at them run. It's happening." Even as hope surged, the Americans remained pinned by sporadic bursts of enemy fire. Whittlesey, aware that premature movement could trigger catastrophe, ordered everyone to hold position. They had endured 4 days of starvation and horror. Now they needed patience for just a few more minutes. Finally, as the sun lowered in the western sky, a clear shape emerged on the northern ridge. A helmet, then a head, then a figure cautiously stepping over the torn earth with a rifle held low. Another figure followed. They wore American uniforms, mud-soaked, ripped, exhausted, but unmistakably American. One of Whittlesey's men shouted, "Friendlies up there!" Another yelled, "They made it!" Voices rose across the ravine, ragged and disbelieving. The soldiers on the ridge heard them. One raised his arm and waved. He shouted something they couldn't quite hear, but the gesture was enough. The lost battalion erupted in cheers, weak, hoarse, cracking cheers that echoed through the forest like the gasp of a man breaking through the surface after nearly drowning. Moments later, a full platoon of American infantry appeared, moving down the ridge cautiously, checking for lingering Germans. Their faces, when they reached the ravine floor, told the story more than words ever could. Shock, horror, disbelief at what they saw. What had once been 554 men was now a shattered skeletal group of survivors, barely recognizable as soldiers. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, bandaged limbs, mud-caked uniforms, the wounded lying beneath branches too weak to move. The dead lined along the slope, covered with what little canvas or cloth remained. The rescuers stared in stunned silence. Some lowered their rifles, some removed their helmets, some simply stood frozen. Then one of them stepped forward and saluted Major Whittlesey. "Sir," he said softly, voice thick with emotion, "we've come to take you home." Whittlesey nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Relief washed over him, but he didn't collapse or break down. He simply exhaled, a long, shaky breath he'd been holding for nearly 5 days. Around him, his men cried openly. Some clung to each other, some laughed in disbelief, others simply stared into space, too numb to react. But all of them knew one truth. They were alive because a small gray pigeon had flown through a storm of bullets and delivered their last hope. As medics and stretcher-bearers poured into the ravine, the wounded were finally tended. Water was passed out, canteens were shared, bandages applied. Men were lifted onto makeshift stretchers or supported by rescuers' arms. And somewhere, many miles away, in a quiet medical corner of division headquarters, Cher Ami was still fighting for her life. The surgeons had made a decision. Her shattered leg could not be saved. They amputated it and fitted a tiny carved wooden prosthetic. They cleaned her wounds, stitched her chest, and kept her warm. No one expected her to survive. But Cher Ami had defied expectations before. She lived. And as word of her impossible flight spread through the division, officers and enlisted men alike visited the tiny bird to pay their respects. Some left crumbs of bread near her box. Others simply stared in awe, whispering, "That's the one. That's the pigeon that saved the lost battalion." Cher Ami became a legend before she could even stand again. Back in the ravine, as the survivors were escorted out of the forest, one soldier looked back over his shoulder and murmured, "We shouldn't have made it. We shouldn't be alive." But they were. And their story, along with the story of one extraordinary pigeon, would echo across generations. In the days that followed the rescue, the remnants of the lost battalion were brought to rear positions for medical care, rest, and debriefings. The men staggered into camp like survivors of a shipwreck, still dazed by the ordeal they had endured. Army doctors examined them one by one, malnourished, dehydrated, wounded, and haunted. Many had lost more than 20 pounds. Others carried shrapnel wounds they had ignored for days. Some were so psychologically exhausted that they could barely speak. Yet they were alive. General Robert Alexander, commander of the 77th Division, visited them personally. He shook hands, offered quiet words of gratitude, and marveled at their resolve. But even he, a veteran of the Great War, struggled to comprehend the suffering etched into their faces. Major Charles Whittlesey, now a national figure almost overnight, was praised for his leadership under impossible conditions. Reporters flocked to his tent, photographers begged for pictures. But Whittlesey did not celebrate. He avoided interviews, offering clipped, modest replies. "My men did their duty," he said. "That is all." He could not bring himself to speak of the screams in the ravine, the men he had watched die, or the desperate moment when friendly shells rained down on his own position. He certainly did not boast of refusing surrender. Instead, he sat quietly beside his surviving officers, comforting the wounded and writing letters to the families of the men who had not come home. For the soldiers, the memories of the Argonne became a weight they carried long after the war ended. Some found solace in knowing they had stood their ground. Others were haunted by the faces of the fallen. But through every nightmare, every flashback, one symbol gave them a strange but genuine comfort. The knowledge that their lives had been spared by a small bird who had given everything she had. Cher Ami became an international sensation. Newspapers across America published dramatic stories of her flight. Children wrote letters asking for pictures of the famous pigeon. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre with palm for extraordinary bravery. American commanders bestowed special honors as well. Soldiers who had scoffed at the idea of pigeons as military assets now spoke of Cher Ami with reverence, even affection. She recovered slowly, learning to balance on her carved wooden leg, her damaged eye permanently closed. But despite her injuries, she regained strength. The Signal Corps decided she should not be returned to combat duty. Instead, they brought her back to the United States, where she was welcomed like a returning hero. At demonstrations and ceremonies, she was often carried in the arms of handlers who spoke softly about the courage of this tiny bird who had flown into the jaws of death. Yet even as Cher Ami became a symbol of American resilience, the deeper story remained one of human suffering, survival, and the indescribable bonds formed in war. Survivors of the lost battalion often spoke her flight not as a miracle, but as a reminder that even in the darkest moments when hope seems crushed under mud and gunfire, salvation can come from the unlikeliest of places. Major Whittlesey, though honored by his country, struggled silently with the weight of what he had experienced. He was promoted, sent to lecture tours, and hailed as a hero. But inside he carried the memories of the ravine like an open wound. In 1921, unable to escape the shadows of war, he took his own life while aboard a ship bound for Cuba. His final letters asked that he not be idealized, not praised, but remembered simply as an officer who did his duty. His death shocked the nation and deeply affected the men who had served under him. Many of them felt that Whittlesey never forgave himself for the losses in the ravine, even though none of it had been his fault. They mourned him as the steady, strong leader who had kept them alive through sheer will and resolve. Cher Ami, too, did not live many years after the war. She passed away in 1919, less than a year after her heroic flight, her body unable to fully recover from the injuries she had sustained. But her legacy endured. The Smithsonian Institution preserved her body, placing her on display as a tribute to her sacrifice. Generations of visitors, veterans, schoolchildren, and historians have stood before the small glass case, reading the plaque that tells how one pigeon saved the lives of nearly 200 American soldiers. As the decades passed, the story of the Lost Battalion became a chapter taught in military academies, a tale of courage and tragedy woven into the fabric of American history. But through all the retellings, one moment always held the spotlight: the release of Cher Ami, wounded and terrified, battling through a storm of bullets to carry a message that would halt the deadly barrage falling on her own comrades. It is easy to forget, in the vastness of a global conflict, how much can hinge on the smallest actions. A message only a few lines long, a flight lasting mere minutes, the beating wings of a creature weighing less than a pound. But in that forest ravine in October 1918, those wings carried the hopes of dying men. They carried desperation. They carried the last thread of life. And they carried it far enough. Long after the war ended, survivors of the Lost Battalion were known to gather on anniversaries, sitting around tables in smoky veterans' halls, reminiscing about the Argonne. They spoke of brothers lost, of battles fought, of quiet acts of bravery no one would ever read about. But when the night grew late, when glasses were emptied and conversations softened, someone would always mention the pigeon. "Remember Cher Ami?" one man would say. And the others would nod, falling silent for a moment, as if seeing her again, limping into headquarters with a torn chest and a missing leg, delivering the message that saved them all. Their voices would grow soft, reverent. "She was just a bird," another might murmur, "but she flew like an angel." And in that simple line lived the truth of the story, that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is small, sometimes fragile, sometimes carried on broken wings. Today, more than a century later, the legend of Cher Ami still endures, passed from parent to child, teacher to student, soldier to soldier. Her story reminds us that heroism can come from the most unexpected places, and that even in moments when all seems lost, hope can rise through the trees on the wings of a single determined soul. Because on that desperate day in the Argonne Forest, when hundreds of men waited in the shadows for deliverance, a pigeon defied bullets, distance, and death itself. And because she did, 194 American soldiers opened their eyes the next morning, alive, breathing, and forever grateful.